In this, I renew my own solemn pledge of duty and service to you all.
What was actually written in the two-line memorandum that caused Queen Camilla to abruptly cancel her private morning engagements? It wasn't a schedule change. It was the formal, irreversible realization that William had systematically dismantled the royal proximity of her granddaughter, leaving no room for appeal. Within the walls of the palace, there is reportedly a register so private that almost no one outside the household ever has cause to see it. It does not concern policy. It does not concern the Constitution. It concerns something far more delicate. It concerns the names of the children the institution is willing to recognize as belonging to its visible future. And according to what royal watchers have spent months quietly piecing together, one of those names appears to have been removed from the latest version of the record, in a way the public was never meant to see. It was not the name most outsiders expected. It was the name of a girl whose only offense was being born into the wrong branch of the family at exactly the wrong historical moment. The name that was preserved, quietly elevated, and protected by every recent signal the institution has quietly offered, was Charlotte's. That, more than any press release, is the real shape of what the palace may have just done. And because this family has always done its heaviest work in the language of names rather than in the language of formal statements, the most important sentence in this entire story was the one the institution never wrote out loud. For those who have not been watching the deeper pattern of this family's quiet institutional language, the move reportedly made behind closed doors over the past several weeks looked, at first, like something every royal watcher thought they understood, but that almost everyone outside this small circle still read differently. On the surface, the story was small. A name, a committee phrase, a change in a register framed in the dry administrative language the institution uses whenever it wants to do something consequential without making a sound. Yet for this family, names are not administrative details. Names are inheritance. Names are legitimacy. Names are the verbal clothing the institution places on a person and refuses to take back without enormous emotional cost. What the decision reportedly suggested, when read carefully, is that the institution has begun to draw a quieter and more consequential line through the next generation than anyone outside the inner circle thought was on the way. And that line, in this family, has always been drawn around something far more than blood. It has always been drawn around memory, around association, around Diana's unbroken presence in the public's moral imagination, around emotional inheritance, and around the unspoken understanding that the institution cannot afford to treat Diana's grandchildren and Camilla's grandchildren as equivalent in the public's eye without paying a costly price it has never quite been willing to pay. If you want to follow this royal saga through the next chapters, especially through the moments when the institution's silent language becomes loud enough for the public to actually hear, subscribe now so you do not miss what is coming. The decisions that move through this family rarely stop once they begin. The first hidden trigger of this moment was not last week, it was not last month. It was a slow process that has been moving inside this family for years, and that almost no viewer of the public-facing schedule ever quite saw because the institution never wanted them to see it. To understand how a young girl who has done nothing wrong can quietly disappear from the institutional imagination of the family she was born into, you have to understand what the family actually believes about itself. The modern British monarchy, for all the ceremonial gold and all the ceremonial language, has always had at its working heart a remarkably simple question: who belongs to the center? Who is allowed to stand inside the rooms where decisions are about to be made? Who carries the institution's public voice and who is permitted only to be seen at the edges? For most of the last century, this question was hard to argue over because the family at the center was small, internally consistent, and publicly legible: the monarch. The heir, the consort, the next heir's family. Around that core, the wider family existed as decoration, as occasional ceremonial warmth, as a way for the public to feel that the monarchy was a real family, rather than an administrative corporation of one. The wider family was welcomed, photographed, included at the right moments, and gently told, in the family's quiet institutional way, that the center of the institution was not really theirs. Most of them accepted that compromise. Most of the public barely noticed the compromise was even being made. The fracture that led to the present moment began, as so many of the modern monarchy's fractures began, with the slow realization that the family had broken its own contract with itself. Charles chose Camilla. The institution allowed the choice. The public, in a long march of acceptance and quiet resistance that ran for almost 2 decades, eventually accepted it too. But acceptance was never the same as resolution. Something inside the family's emotional ledger remained unresolved. Something continued to suggest that even with the new marriage firmly settled, the institution's deep emotional center of gravity was still located somewhere Charles had never quite been willing to leave, behind a face no one at the palace ever officially described as sacred, but that the public never stopped treating as sacred. Diana's moral position inside the public's memory never dimmed. It intensified. And as it intensified, it placed an institutional pressure on the family that no press release could satisfy. The pressure said, in effect, that the monarchy could not honor Camilla's acceptance at the institution's center, while pretending that Diana's emotional centrality did not exist. The pressure said the institution had to choose, in its slow institutional language, what its actual emotional future was going to be. And the family for years refused the choice. They tried to split the difference. They tried to honor both. They tried to imagine that the institution's emotional geometry could include Diana's symbolic centrality and Camilla's practical presence at the same weight, without paying any cost. That compromise, held up for nearly 25 years, has now begun to crack. What cracked it was not a single dramatic event. It was, as is so often the case, a sequence of small institutional decisions that anyone could have missed, but that the family most attuned to the institution's silent grammar has been reading carefully for the past year. The Royal Records Chamber, the private archive that formally tracks the institution's recognition of family members, was reportedly updated in recent months in a way that drew almost no commentary from the mainstream press. The update was framed as a routine refresh of household records. Inside the update, however, were subtle shifts. A patronage list was reportedly revised. A ceremonial category was reportedly tightened. Several long-standing entries associated with Camilla's branch of the family were reportedly not renewed in the way they had been renewed in previous years. And, perhaps most consequentially, the institutional references to the children of Camilla's children, the children who carry her family name by birth, were reportedly revised to remove language that had previously walked a careful line between private dignity and visible recognition. None of this looked, when it was first reported, particularly explosive. It looked administrative. It looked like housekeeping. But in the monarchy's institutional language, none of these signals are ever housekeeping. They are evidence. If you have spent any time watching this family, you already know the most important signal of all when the institution wants to do something quietly. It is not the press release. It is not the headline. It is the visible redistribution of small courtesies. Who is invited to the private chapel before the public appearance? Who is asked to walk first through the photograph door at the family event? Who is placed at the right hand of the empty chair that will one day be filled by a monarch? Who is asked to remain behind when the others step forward? The signals all moved in the same direction over the past several months, and they suggested, even to viewers who did not initially want to read them as evidence, that the family was making a quiet institutional choice about who its visual future would include, and who its visual future would politely sideline. Anne, who has spent her entire public life as the monarchy's institutional conscience, has reportedly been the figure most willing to confirm the shift publicly without ever appearing to do so. At 2 non-ceremonial events this spring, she was observed in ways that royal watchers have since analyzed in extraordinary detail. She was warm, in her blunt institutional way, to Charlotte. She was visibly more formal than necessary toward Camilla's eldest granddaughter. She was seen chatting at length with Catherine about schools, about children, about the future, in a setting where the cameras recorded the conversation but misread its weight entirely. Anne does not waste gestures. Anne does not waste time. And royal watchers now believe that what Anne was doing in those settings was quietly telling the public exactly where the institution's confidence in the next generation was going to rest. Anne was confirming Charlotte. She was gently unfurling the welcome mat in a way the institution had previously not dared to unfurl. And in this family's most subtle institutional language, that confirmation is one of the strongest signals the monarchy can offer. What happened next, the moment the question hardened from speculation into a formal institutional rehearsal, is reported to have taken place in early summer. The setting was private. The composition of the room was small. The tone, according to what sources close to the inner workings of the household typically describe about such meetings, was not angry. It was businesslike. It was, at times, almost gentle. And that, more than any shouting match, is the sign that the decision had already been made before anyone walked into the room. William, who speaks comparatively little in the most consequential family meetings and who weighs each word as if it might outlive him, is reported to have framed the discussion in the institution's most careful language. He did not name Camilla's granddaughter. He did not name Diana's. He did not reference any of the household names directly. He referenced, instead, the institution's long-term capacity to carry public affection across 2 more generations. He referenced the public's quiet but durable moral memory. He referenced what historians would, in time, describe as the family's emotional continuity. He spoke about Charlotte in terms that anyone in the room understood were not arguments about a child, but were statements about the institution's future face. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Charles, who has carried the impossible weight of this family's emotional contradictions for longer than almost anyone alive, is reported to have listened without visibly resisting in the room. He is said to have made one quiet attempt to steer the discussion toward a softer framing, the kind of framing that would have allowed Camilla's family to retain a quieter symbolic presence even as the institutional recognition was reformed. That attempt was reportedly deflected in the language of gentle institutional compromise. Not in the language of refusal, in the language of timing, of capacity, of public readiness. The room did not tell Charles that his position was wrong. The room told him that the institution's emotional economy could not sustain both expressions at the position he wanted them to occupy. And Charles, after the briefest possible pause, accepted the framing. The moment the family moved from discussion to formal internal decision, the visible record began to shift almost immediately. The committee paperwork that had previously been quietly rewritten was reportedly approved at a higher level. A formal consultation was reportedly closed in a way that did not require any further institutional language. And the small, symbolic spaces of the family, the kind of spaces that royal watchers read as more honest than the press conferences, began to align with the new direction. Charlotte was reportedly given a small enlargement of her formal duties, a slowly growing pattern of acceptance that royal watchers have been watching with unusual intensity for close to a year. Camilla's granddaughter, by contrast, was reportedly removed from an item she had briefly held within the formal recognition the institution extends to certain extended family members who show promise of carrying public-facing roles in the long term. The change was small. The change was enormous, because in this family, what the institution does with these small recognitions is not administrative housekeeping. It is the institution telling the public who it considers to be visibly part of its emotional future and who it does not. The decision, when seen in its full context, was reported to mark one of the clearest realignments of the monarchy's emotional geography in the modern era. The institution had not openly contradicted Charles. The institution had not humiliated Camilla. The institution had not officially and publicly erased a child. It had done something more institutional and more durable than any of those things. It had quietly redefined which line of the family the institution was prepared to carry as the moral center of its visible future. And the line it chose was Diana's. That choice, when it settles fully into the public imagination, will not read as a personal triumph of one royal over another. It will read as the institution finally admitting, in its slow institutional voice, what the public has known for a very long time. That Diana, whatever the institution's earlier compromises tried to imply, was the figure who taught the monarchy what emotional authenticity looked like in the modern era. That her daughter's grief was not a public relations inconvenience, but a national wound the institution never finished treating. That the children she left behind, particularly the daughter who carries her name and who will one day shape the monarchy's public life in a way no one at the palace can quite imagine yet, deserve the institution's full formal embrace. And that those who came after, whose presence in the family is constitutional and proper and dignified in their own right, do not need to be publicly elevated to feel embraced. Their dignity can live in their private lives. Their public role, which is a different and more consequential matter, can be allowed to remain at the edges the institution has quietly begun to redraw. Anne is reported to have backed the decision in the room in language that almost no public commentator has so far understood. She is said to have pointed out that the institution's greatest public risk in the next generation was not the failure to honor anyone. It was the failure to identify clearly who the public should attach its trust to. She described the public's love, in a way one of those present later said they would never quite forget, as a fire that requires a steady hearth. Without a clear hearth, the fire does not grow, it scatters. Anne is said to have told the room that the monarchy, in this decade, was attempting to launch too many simultaneous inheritances, and would, without clarity, eventually leave the public cold. William is reported to have agreed. Catherine is said to have been present, not as a speaker, but as the emotional presence the room could not quite look away from, in the way of someone whose example has, for years now, been quietly teaching the institution what quiet service actually looks like. The public reaction to the decision has been mixed in the way every major royal decision is mixed, but it has carried one unusually consistent feature that royal watchers have noted carefully. The generational split is sharp. Among older viewers who grew up with Diana as a near-daily presence in their emotional education, the decision has been read from the very first rumor as long overdue moral repair. They have said openly, in comment sections and in family conversations, that they had been waiting close to 3 decades for the institution to admit, in any way it could bring itself to admit, that Diana's emotional centrality never actually ended. They have said that to see Charlotte quietly being given what her grandmother had always deserved is not politics to them. It is grief being treated with dignity. It is the public's emotional inheritance finally being respected by the institution that once asked the public to carry it. Among younger viewers, and particularly among the Anglophone audience outside Britain who have watched the British monarchy as a kind of moral theatre for decades, the reaction has been less sentimental and more structural. They have read the move as institutional modernization. They have read it as William's first major step toward declaring what kind of monarchy he intends to lead. They have read it as the monarchy finally admitting that popular emotional legitimacy is as real a form of power as constitutional legitimacy, and must be respected as such. These viewers have largely welcomed the move, often using language that is less about Diana and more about the monarchy's future capacity to remain useful to the country it serves. Among Camilla's supporters, the reaction has been quieter than most observers expected. There has been visible disappointment. There has been the predictable polite statement from unofficial defenders that Camilla herself has handled the moment with characteristic dignity. But underneath the polite language, what royal watchers have read from the careful silence of Camilla's most loyal circles is something closer to acceptance than open objection. Many of them reportedly understood that this moment was coming. Many of them quietly prepared privately for it. Camilla, who has lived through a long and at times brutal public negotiation of her place inside this family, is reported to have understood the decision with the kind of quiet private dignity the institution rarely thanks but always recognizes. She is said to have reached out to Charles privately in the days after the decision. She is said to have reached out to no one publicly. That restraint, royal watchers note, may be the most powerful statement Camilla has made in her entire time as queen consort. What happened in this decision is not a story of one royal triumphant over another. It is the story of an institution finally deciding what its emotional North Star must be. For most of the last quarter century, the monarchy has tried to navigate by 2 stars at once. It tried to honor Diana's memory while simultaneously giving Camilla the institutional spaciousness her marriage required. That navigation was sometimes graceful, often painful, and never quite stable. The decision reportedly made recently is the institution finally letting go of the attempt. It is the monarchy turning its face toward the star most visible to the public and saying, in its slow institutional voice, that this is the direction we will hold to. Not because the other star has disappeared. The other star remains. It remains constitutional. It remains respected. It remains present at the family table. But the institution's emotional alignment, the alignment that decides which grandchildren the public is invited to see as the family's emotional continuity, has shifted. The institution has chosen, and the choice, when it finally settles into public memory, will read as one of the most consequential moral acts the modern monarchy has performed on itself. If you have watched this whole story unfold to this point, I want to ask you one direct question, and I would like you to answer it in the comments below. Do you believe the institution was right to quietly elevate Charlotte's symbolic position now, in this decade, rather than waiting another generation and pretending the emotional question would quietly resolve itself? Or do you believe the institution moved too fast and should have allowed Camilla's family more breathing room before naming its visual future so clearly? Take a side. Tell me how you read it, because the answer you give will tell us, collectively, what kind of monarchy the public actually wants to live with in the next 50 years. What is still to come in the next chapter of this royal saga is the question I will leave you with tonight. The decision that has just been quietly made about Charlotte and about Camilla's granddaughter will not sit still. It will travel through every ceremonial schedule that the next reign will ever produce. It will travel through every patronage list. It will travel through every photograph arrangement. It will travel through every private chapel invitation. It will travel through every household staffing choice. It will travel through every future balcony appearance and every future state visit. It will become the basis on which the next reign is structured before the next reign ever formally begins. And what it will eventually demand of the monarchy, the very first morning the public wakes up into that next reign, is a clear answer to one question the institution has been avoiding for decades. Can a monarchy that finally chose Diana's emotional future as its visual North Star hold that choice steady when the pressures of state, the pressures of legacy, the pressures of family loyalty, and the pressures of Camilla's still living dignity begin to pull it back toward the older compromise? That is the question the next chapter of this story will have to answer. If you want to be here for that answer, subscribe to this channel and stay close, because the monarchy has begun to speak, and it is the kind of speaking that changes everything quietly, permanently, and for generations. I will see you in the next video.